is moving. Great, thanks, Pete. So our final session is kind of widening the discussion a little bit further and thinking about the wider use and importance of care records. So I'm really delighted we have two speakers in this session. And first, we are going to hear from Malkiat Thiarai on information governance and access to data for collaborative research. And I will do the 2-minute reminder when you're approaching the 10 minutes. But over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm just going to share my screen if I can. See if I can. Can you let me know if you can see my presentation?
We can see it. That's great.
That's all good. Okay,
because I can't see anything else on the screen, so I'll just talk, and then if there's any issues, then please just let me know. So I'm Malkiat Thiarai. I'm the head of corporate information management at Birmingham City Council and the data protection officer. And I've had some I've done some work with the first phase of MIRRA, you know, the presentation I'll be doing is were research findings that were presented as part of my PhD study, which I've now completed at the University of Warwick. And the research study was looking very much at what you could do with social care data, how you could access it for research purposes, and different types of analysis and research that could be carried out. So the data was extracted from the council's social care system, which is called Care First, and it's the system that's provided by OLM, who I know have been sort of involved in the collaboration of this. We looked at the data from April 2013 to 2016. The data itself was pseudonymized, but we retained the personal identifier so that we could understand the impact of the way that information was being recorded at an individual level. And for that period of time, we were looking at just over 63,000 unique individuals within our data, and just over 750,000 records. These were the different sort of attributes that we picked out. So starting from the top, you know, we were looking at the user, the person ID, the date of birth, the start end dates of agreements that related to services that were being provided. But then as you go further on down, what we started to look at was actually the way that things were being described and recorded as part of the social care process. So, you know, the assessment reason, the form outcome, the teams that were associated, and the cost and service levels to give us some sort of real better understanding of exactly what it was that was being recorded on the system as part of the social care record, as the service users and the social workers were working, you know, were going through that whole process. So for this particular part of the research, what we looked at, we kind of split it into 3 different case studies. One was a sort of a technology focus, which looked at, you know, the way in which the system was being set up and created to record the different sort of requirements. So one of the elements was what was a reason and an outcome for a particular activity being recorded. The second one was we looked at it from the process focus, so how you could break down the children's social care process down into sub-processes, so you could potentially identify different elements of activity at different stages of the research process. And then the final one was a people focus, which was very much to look at, given the way that the data was being structured on the system, what did it look like from the point of view of the individual whose record it was. So on the screen, what you see is the example of something that is recorded on the system, so the way it's described and how that particular form is completed and described as that. And as we said, there were 268 different combinations of this reason and outcome that we identified from the data. So this is an example of all 268 forms and outcomes. So basically the starting and ending dates of when the system was making use of these particular types of outcomes. The single most commonly recorded outcome is actually the fact that supervision of a social worker had been recorded. And I know from previous sort of conversations with colleagues from MIRRA, this is one of the sort of the key challenges with social work records, is that they relate as much to the social worker as they do to the individual. And the second most common one was actually recording of a statutory visit, and these records reflect the number of service users that were impacted. But what we found was actually a lot of the records relate to sometimes less than 1,000, or even less than 100 service users. So there would be variations of the way in which the records would be recorded. The next thing we did was looked at it from the point of view of how we could create subsets of the process itself. So we spoke to our social work colleagues at the council and sort of said, how would you describe these particular outcomes? And they came up with 6 different ways of describing the process subsets. So what we looked at then was, for each process subset, how we could, at what point was particular types of activity more prevalent in the recording process. And as you can see from this, there are pockets where a particular type of recording suddenly became more prevalent in the recording process than they had previously. And for one of them, there was a sub-process that was called CIN stage, which was the Children in Need stage, where all the processes in the system started and ended at exactly the same time. And again, the orange colours represent higher instances of access or use. And again, this is the child protection and safeguarding stage. And then the last process that we looked at was how this reflected individual service users. So these 5 boxes are actually the way in which the records relate to the people within the system who had the highest number of records, and over this period of time, at what stages or in what parts of the sub-process their records or their data was being processed or being created. And then this is an example of a single individual. So this is a way of sort of describing or showing what information is being created against an individual users by linking the type of access, the type of activity to a particular sort of sub process. So if you take the red bits, that's all related to, children in care and court work activity, and the thicker the lines, the more instances of that particular activity being recorded in this particular activity. So from an information governance perspective, what we kind of were looking at was actually what are the circumstances in which the technology and the systems need to be changed. And every time there's a change, there needs to be it needs to be implemented, it needs to be tested, and staff need to be trained in those changes. From the process perspective, what we identified was actually there seemed to be processes that were created that were sort of popular is probably not the right word, but were sort of more prevalent at particular times over that period of time. When
2 minutes remaining.
Yeah, okay, I'm almost done. So the second one was around, again, process, which is about identifying potentially the way that new practice or new social work practice was being implemented to describe, but one, to describe how records were created, but secondly, how social workers were being asked to record. And the third sort of case study was very much looking at a lot of the things that have been covered over these past 2 days, which is what does that actually mean for the individual whose records are being created and how they can then access those records subsequently. I mean, I did put a slide in for questions, but that's as much as I needed to say. So I'm happy to take questions or take questions after the end of the next speaker.
Thanks so much for that. I think we'll do the other speaker and maybe we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions at the end, but thanks very much for that. Great. So now we have Katie Ellis from Sheffield University, who is talking on, I got it, expecting it to clear things up, accessing care files after leaving care. So welcome, Katie. Lovely to have you with us, and over to you.
Thanks, Anna. So I'll try and share my screen, but I'm not very optimistic. Oh, there. Can everyone see that?
That's great.
Thank you. So thanks so much for inviting me to speak. It's been a pleasure to be here today, and I've learned so much already. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about my research, which focused on young people leaving care to go to university. I wanted to explore how the journeys of care experienced students might have differed from those who didn't go to university. After working with young people quite a lot in prison and different special schools, I guess, I really wanted to try and flip the negative outcomes of being in care. And I hoped that care experienced students might report positive experiences of care and lasting stable relationships with people who'd invested in them. I hypothesised that maybe these young people had gone into care later or experienced kinship care or maybe had long-term foster placements, but just somehow their journey might have been less traumatic. Sadly, this often wasn't the case, and the majority of participants reported that they had experienced difficult journeys through care. They were filled with instability and a host of different professionals and carers moving in and out of their lives. So my talk today is going to focus particularly on the importance of care files and around some of the difficulties that our participants faced when trying to access them. So my project was funded for 3 years by the Leverhulme Trust, and it was supported, let's put that down, by a group of 3 care experienced students. So I conducted interviews with 42 university students from 4 universities. Interviews lasted around 2 hours and explored pathways through care, starting from when young people went into care and tracked their perspectives from then until the present day. Afterwards, interview questions were formatted into an online survey to test across a wider subset of the care experienced student population. So far, 192 students responded to the survey. So in total, 234 care experienced students shared their experiences with the project. So in common with the majority of looked after children, our participants often entered care after experiencing abuse, neglect, bereavement and other trauma. Most had vivid memories about certain aspects of going into care. However, many were unclear about the specific reasons for their removal and the decisions that had been made on their behalf. So I was just checking that the chat wasn't saying I'd cut off. Participants described making a sense of their early transitions as piecing together half-remembered events with faceless but important people. Arlo describes the day he went into care. One day, Dad came back from court. He was just like, they're coming to take the kids away. And we were like, what is he talking about? And they had no idea that that process was ongoing at that point. Charlotte described being moved suddenly to unfamiliar places with people she'd never met. And she says the social worker took us to this random place. I'd never met them, complete strangers, and we're all just sat on the sofa. But there are sometimes safeguarding issues which determine what young people can be told. But our research confirmed that young people were moved suddenly, without notice, to somewhere unfamiliar, without any indication about when they might ever see their birth families again. So care files can be really important to bridge these gaps in understanding. And often our respondents reported that they'd attempted to access these files in an attempt to learn more about why they were placed in care. In fact, care files were thought to serve a number of purposes. As well as keeping an accurate record of key events, care files are also a helpful way of ensuring that children don't have to disclose upsetting information more than once, especially when meeting a new social worker or personal advisor. But unfortunately, participants didn't feel that professionals always use their files in the way that they should, and felt that on occasion, they were instead used to share details of conversations that were felt to be confidential and not for sharing. As might be expected, this could negatively impact young people's views of the professionals they worked with, and hence mean that they stopped sharing information that might be seen as significant. Anna explains, "You're too scared to say anything because nothing's a secret, is it? Everything just gets back to everyone else." So whereas Anna felt that her files had been used to share too much information, Willow felt that professionals working with her did not refer to them enough, meaning that she was forced to recount difficult circumstances again and again with new professionals. And she says, "A few turned up and they hadn't even read my case file. I was like, you don't even have a clue." Although it's understandable that children are restricted from accessing information contained in their files while they are children, a number of our participants attempted to access these files once they reached the age of 18. And far from clearing things up, like Jackie so powerfully described, care files were often extremely disappointing and contained more gaps than answers to long-pondered questions. Although offers of support were made by local authorities to help care leavers accessing their files for the first time, often this support was missing. Instead, participants described receiving deliveries of large quantities of brown envelopes via courier to read and digest in their own time. And Charlotte explains, she was like, "Well, once you've read it, obviously it can be quite a traumatic time. We've got counselling and stuff like that. We can get you in quick." But by the time she came to receive her file, she'd already had a few more personal advisors and so never received any support. And as well as gaps in support, we found that care files left lots of gaps in knowledge too. So although participants described seeking to access files to clarify the reasoning behind decisions that had previously felt unjust, and Charlotte explains, "I think she made false accusations. It'd be interesting if there's anything on my files about that, because she's obviously made up lies about my mum." And so Charlotte was hoping to understand the professional's perspective so she could see for herself through her adult eyes whether decisions had been made in the way that were, I suppose, fair. But despite seeking these answers, information contained in the file was often not sufficient to offer clear explanations. And large sections were heavily redacted, meaning that information contained within files became practically worthless. And Craig explains, "I got it expecting to clear things up. And I think that's the reason you went into care. This is what happened while you were in care, things that I can't remember. But half of it is crossed out. So you have to try and guess what it means or who they're talking about." So although participants had described seeking to access care files to better understand their story and to gain some kind of closure on their time in care, often their questions remained unanswered. And Craig explains again, "I thought it would help me to understand the bigger picture, but it doesn't. The thing that annoys me is someone sat in an office in social services, and they know way more about my life than I do."
2 minutes remaining, Katie.
Thank you. And for me, this brings to mind work I did with Girls in Secure Care, who felt that care files were very much the property of professionals and used as a means to share difficult and stigmatising information behind the backs of those they cared for. And I've actually put the reference to that paper if you're interested in having a look at it. But obviously this isn't the intention of care files, and much more needs to be done to enable care leavers to access a fair and inclusive account of their past. So I think I am out of time now, but thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the project, I've put their website on the top of the slide.
Thanks so much, Katie, for that. And I think what you've brought out has been echoed throughout today and sort of really resonates with things that have been shared by the care leavers that are here as well. So thank you. I think reinforcing some central messages there. Elizabeth, do we have time to do some questions? Yeah, would anybody like to ask a question of Katie or Malkiat? Okay, I'm interested in what you were saying, Katie, about sharing practices and how actually done well, it could mean that people aren't having to disclose traumatic information over and over again, but done badly means that confidential information is shared when it shouldn't and things like that. So do you have any, what's your sort of perspective on what could change in order to make that shift to better sharing practice?
Yeah, when I did my PhD, I did it with girls in secure accommodation, and a lot of these girls were termed as being very vulnerable, and they'd experienced sexual exploitation and things like that, and they had a really dim view of case files and sharing information. And the way that the unit dealt with that was they wrote case files together. So they had a section that would be, professionals account of a situation, and then they'd ask the young person to directly respond, and then they would sign it together. And that kind of seemed to unpick the mystery of some of the content of the files. And I actually interviewed the girls in the home, but also read their files separately. And it was quite interesting that you'd read the professional's account, saying, for instance, Abby did this and it went wrong and she lost her temper. And then underneath, Abby would write, "This is really untrue. They just annoyed me a lot, so I did." And it was really nice that you could actually see her voice coming through. But the other point of that is that already Abby knows what that account says. She had the chance to read it and then to respond. And that seemed a really nice way to give young people some influence over the information that's stored about them.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you also for the comments that have gone in from Karen and Linda that sort of enhances our understanding of the impact that kind of poor practice has. So thank you for that. I think we can wrap this session up and I can hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to our speakers in that panel as well. It's great to hear about all the different aspects of the care experience and in relation to records, and how those can both be created and used fruitfully for further research. So all I really wanted to do now was to wrap up the 2 days. This is the end of our MIRRA Plus project. It's been amazing to be able to work with such fantastic co-researchers and colleagues through the last year, and in fact since 2017 on the first MIRRA project. To work with people have moved on. Victoria Hoyle worked with us in the first project. We've had Pete Williams working with us in the second project. It has been amazing. I want to say a really big thank you to everybody who's been involved, because it's been a phenomenal experience for me, and I hope for many people involved. Obviously, I want to say a really big thank you to our care experienced contributors, because their experience, their feelings, their needs and wants, that has to be at the middle of all of this. This has to be front and centre, and everything else needs to fit around that. And we really need to work together now to make sure that what they need and want to know about their childhood, what they want to record about their childhood when they're in care, what they want to find out about it later, is paramount, and that somehow all the other systems and processes and organisations and professions that sit around the delivery of all the legal, regulatory and bureaucratic processes which are required, somehow all of that is bent to the needs of the care experience person. And I think that does really require a huge shift in focus, a huge shift in the way people think about this when they're doing their professional jobs. And I know from talking to so many of you that there's incredible willingness to make things better. And now we have to find ways of making the systems that support these things also do what we all want. So I'm very pleased with the to be able to present the app to you today, and we are still planning what we might do in future. We don't know exactly what further work we'll be able to do in this arena, but it's certainly something we'd like to continue to work with many of you on. So we will make sure to let you know about our plans and future developments and the results when they're published in various ways of this project. And really just to say now, thank you all for coming. Thank you to all our speakers and chairs. Thank you to all of you for your great breakout room contributions. And we look forward to meeting up with many of you again in future. So thank you all so much.